You know, we've been sold this false choice of policing or nothing, which has been used to terrorize people into accepting policing.
Our guest is here, folks.
Yes, our guest is here.
Ole, do you want to introduce
Good
him?
timing. I can add him now.
Hold on. Oh, look, you already. Hi, Matthew.
Quick. I'm too quick. Sorry.
Yeah, y'all are way too quick. I was trying to get us gathered to do a very responsible and give you the professional introduction that you deserved, but they were too fast. And I used to deal with whatever this is. All right. We are so excited to have Matthew here. He is our first guest we're bringing on to show y'all a trailer for a documentary that he did that is really important, and we're going to give him an opportunity to answer some questions, tell y'all a little bit about this documentary and this work. So this is Matthew Solomon.
Hello.
Hey,
nice
Matthew.
Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you. It's surreal because I watch you guys all the time, and now I'm like, oh, my face is on here too. So
it's a great name, by the way.
Oh, nice.
Right back at you.
I'm used to this, being on shows with other Matthews and Matts. So going forward, it'll probably simpler if everyone just refers to me as Binder, so we don't get them confused.
I do anyways, so that works out for me.
There you go.
Okay. Awesome. That makes sense.
If you want, I can bring up the trailer now, so we have a kind of basis.
Yeah, let's watch that.
Sure.
Watch the trailer.
America has never been a place where we had democracy and equality and freedom and liberty for all and justice for all, and all we have to do is get back to that.
Race in this country has never really been removed from the political dialogue.
Because we won't reckon with our past, because we will let older people say, oh, that's so old, and let's not talk about that anymore. Slavery was so long ago. We haven't had it for 200 years. This is, not realizing that we never reckoned, we never repaired any of it at all.
Police are violence workers. You know, we've been sold this false choice of policing or nothing, which has been used to terrorize people into accepting policing when there's a whole long list of things that they would rather have that they know would help address the problems in their communities.
When we say abolish the police, we are saying we do not want policing as we know it to exist anymore.
What people don't realize when we're talking about abolition is that we're really talking about the fact that we want you to be a decent person, that it's going to require that you relate to people.
We created a report and it's called Defunding the Police, Defining the Way Forward for HRM. The myth is that we need all these people in jail all day, be running around the streets, and that's not true. So I really try to shift us from believing that defunding is radical to recognizing that what is actually radical is investing billions of dollars into policing. So not agree that defunding the police is this radical lefty, communist, Marxist, whatever, that is actually practical, it's good social policy, it makes sense, and here's a roadmap to it.
This is not some kind of abstract utopian envisioning. This is a very practical programmatic intervention.
When you begin to think differently and you begin to look at people through the eyes of the humanity in all of us and sort of that love for humankind, your thinking and your approach to the work starts to be very different.
Very well done.
Wow.
Very cool.
Yeah. So this is amazing. I really wanted to bring you because obviously we're having a lot of conversations. You see it a lot in the news, whether it be as just a political pawn or a reason, they're not giving it its due when talking about defund the police or abolition. So it's great to see people doing the work of compiling, talking to these experts, because it's right. It's a policy initiative and it makes sense and it's reasonable, but they don't present us with these experts. That's not the research they're presenting us with. Instead, they just kind of throw it out, as a radical, ridiculous thing. They don't engage it on a substantive level. So it's amazing that you went and did this. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us about it, how you decided to do this and what you really learned from this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. The short version is I went back to school during the pandemic to get a master's degree in public administration so that I could better use my privilege and my access along. I was doing a lot of conflict resolution consulting before the pandemic and traveling. And so, I wanted to go back to school, get a degree, and to, enhance what I was able to do. And so through the coursework, this was summer of 2020, 2021, I was applying the issues with policing and incarceration and the, homelessness to my coursework in public administration. What makes communities sustainable? What makes communities work? Why are they set up the way that they're set up? And so when it came time to do my final project, instead of writing a paper, one of my advisors was like, you're a filmmaker. Why don't you do a film? And they're like, it could be like a short 10-minute, sizzle reel or something. And I was like, if I do a movie, it's going to be like a real movie. And so that's what I set out to do. And I, originally I was thinking 4 or 5 people to interview. And then it was like, oh, I need this perspective and this other perspective. And people were, I would interview somebody who would refer me to somebody else. And it just kind of grew into this thing, which I'm really happy about, because I think, there's a lot of different perspectives. It's not just activists. There's, the district attorney of LA County. There's, USC law professor. There's a sociologist, Nikki Black, who's a friend of mine. Gina Viola, who ran for mayor in the city of Los Angeles on an abolitionist platform and came in third. Hawk Newsom, Black Lives Matter, New York. Dr. L. Jones is a professor in Halifax, Nova Scotia, who co-wrote a 200-page report on how do we defund the police, and it was commissioned by the city of Halifax. So, and then Hadia Kennedy, who's a former LAPD officer, and Senate Devermont, who's Mr. Checkpoint, who films police and has, I've been following him. So, I wanted to get all those perspectives. And I think, the feedback has been that the documentary really makes the case for what it's like, why it's like this, and here are the steps that we can, take that are actionable and make sense to actually have like safety for everyone and stop, funneling money into this, policing and incarceration, that's just like, money out the window instead of actually investing in people. Yeah.
That is amazing, Matthew. That's a really productive use of your time during the pandemic. In the course of conducting all those interviews,
I played video games.
In the course of conducting all those interviews, Matthew, what would you say stood out to you or surprised you the most? Was that you learned?
Yeah. So, going into it, so in the course of the master's program, I wasn't an abolitionist. I was, something needs to change, something drastically needs to change. I was coming from consulting. So I was like, well, maybe if the police just knew how to like listen better or something, So through the course of my research, I started reading abolitionist work, Mariame Kaba, Angela Davis, of course, and so got to the point where, okay, now I'm like all in on abolition. And so the messages of Hawk Newsom, Nikki Black, even George Gascon, who's not an abolitionist, by any means.
Yeah.
Like they were all talking about love. When you view another person through the lens of love, you're going to care about them. You're going to care about, supporting them. And so it's a much different perspective than the punishment bureaucracy that we live in. So love was like the thing that was like, oh, that's what this is about.
That's funny that you say that. I have an essay called Love and Abolition, and it's about that. That basically fear is the emotion. As much as we talk about emotions and feelings as though it's something that should be outside of this, so we shouldn't move with our emotions. The reality is emotions is what motivates and dictates all of the things and decisions that we make. And mass incarceration is fueled by fear. That's what that's about. And in order for us to create or imagine a different world that actually addresses the root causes of issues and tries to help people in these under-resourced communities, we have to move from a place of love. So it's interesting that you say that. Also, that makes me think of this too. I too was introduced to books in my eventual journey. How I became an abolitionist, and for me, it was Our Prisons Are Obsolete. Which book did you read?
That was the first one.
Yes,
that was the first one.
That's what did it for you.
That's what started it.
Yeah.
And then I was in a class and I was like, yeah, I'm on board with this, but what do we do with the violent offenders? Right.
Yeah. That narrative.
And one of my classmates was like, you should read Mariam Kaba, We Do This Till We Free Us.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're done with that, come back and we'll talk. And so I read that. And then Alex Vitale's book, End of Police.
Yeah. I saw you had Alex.
Yeah. So all of that, you know.
This is beautiful. That was honestly, that's very amazing work. And I'm really glad that you did that, because it's good to see like there being resources that we can point to, because at some point abolition has always been here. Although even in these last few years, it's kind of appearing to people as though it's new. This is a much larger, but I think it's been inaccessible to a lot of our everyday people. It's been something we know about in academia, in organizer spaces, but there haven't always been these resources that we could point to and pin to people. So this is beautiful that you did this, that you did the work, that you put in all this time and energy to create this resource we could reurence to and show people. So I'm really glad that you were able to come here tonight so we could show our audience.
Thank you.
I feel like this is no, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to say, regarding academia, one of the things that was frustrating to me was there's not a lot of published work in journals on abolition.
Yeah.
And that was something, as I was doing my work, it's like I really want to facilitate the conversation, or to bridge the conversation is probably the better word, for like, if not police and prisons, then what?
Right.
And so that's as a filmmaker, because my background is in filmmaking, I saw that as my way to use my skills, to be able to do this.
If people who are at home watching this and are wondering what's the first thing they could do if they're interested in learning about abolition, or how can they learn more or get more involved, where would you direct them first? Where do you think is a good starting place?
Well, I mean, my website for the movie.
You better go ahead and plug that, Matthew.
Awesome.
Plug it.
But
I appreciate
I have a page of resources on there.
Oh, great.
But I would say connect with your local Black Lives Matter chapters. If there's any abolitionist organizations like Critical Resistance LA, Critical Resistance LA sponsored a screening. I know that they have chapters in New York. That would be the place, is really just to get in with the groups that are in your area.
Yeah.
And reading the books and my goal with this film was to have it be another resource where it's like, okay, you want to know what this is about? Here, go watch this movie.
Yeah. Mike.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I feel like this documentary comes at the perfect time, because what has really bothered me lately is, and this is kind of like a pretty common liberal phenomenon, is this instinct to run away from slogans once the right wing inevitably demonizes them. So the one that comes to mind is defund the police. That kind of emerged organically out of the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. And then you see it get picked apart, and then whatever, momentum was there for it gets pushed away. And then we get into this dumb conversation about, oh, well, what if they phrased it this way or that way? Just putting aside the fact that regardless of how you phrase it, there's going to be opposition to that regardless. So I feel like to have this as a resource is really important. And one thing that drove me closer towards abolition, and I'm still learning, but I would probably fall into that camp, is that the story of Tyree Nichols, for example, for that story, you can't look at that story and not question the system, because it's not the easiest explanation, right? Like when you see Derek Chauvin have his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, you can attribute that to, wow, that's racism. But when it comes to 5 black cops beating a black man for 3 minutes, white liberals can't necessarily just say, oh, well, that's just racism, because they can't. And it gets people to think about it as this whole system is inherently messed up.
Yeah.
It's the system itself. It's the way that cops are essentially this militarized force who's overseeing subjects and not, protecting and serving. So I feel like to have the documentary as a resource right now is really critical, because I feel like there's this huge retreat that I've seen, at least in my bubbles that I've seen, where people are running away from defund the police or defund the police because it doesn't pull well, when that's missing the entire conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think people need to remember that social justice movements, they are emerged in the minority. They're never going to be the majority in polling support. That's not how it works. Obviously, you get grassroots organizations, you get resistance, you get because they're resisting what is the majority, the status quo. So obviously, yes, the majority of a country is going to support what has been the status quo that they've been indoctrinated to believe. That doesn't mean you abort mission. Like that's the point. It's why it's a fight. It's why it's an uphill battle. So that is very much so something we need to start taking into consideration. And you're right, Mike. People don't really understand systemic racism and what it means for something to be systemic, and they don't get that. They'll be like, oh, well, they're black ops. The system, this is embedded. We're being educated the same way. You can internalize anti-blackness as a black person the same way a white person can. And if you are in an organization that teaches you to operate a certain way, teaches you to view people a particular, certain people and certain populations a particular way, and that violence, something people need to understand. And I think we have to start, myself included, like changing how I go about this in discourse and talking about police brutality. Is people take police brutality to be the instances when they see the police kill somebody, rather than like, what is how violent, and I think Alex Vitale does a great job of talking about this in End of Policing, that violence is actually a part of policing in America. That is a part of it. That's why you see so much brutalization. That's why there's so many settlements, so many lawsuits and all these. That's why there's qualified immunity. That's why that's there. That's why it's there, because that's a part of it. So that's something we got to talk about. If that's in the entire how it's set up, and I think, you know, later on we'll probably talk about it. I saw somebody in the comments mention talking about Cop City, because I think this will eventually segue us there to how violence. Yep, Lance.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to ask Matthew a question. Something that comes up frequently, especially when you're talking to people who advocate for police abolition or stuff like that, is do you have concrete plans to put some system in place as you advocate for something such as getting rid of the current system? And or the practical answer, like you brought it up very briefly when you were talking about Angela Davis's book, when you get asked that question, like, so do you want violent criminals to just roam the streets, right? Do you come at that outside of just the, like, well, just from a philosophy, this is more about, like, you know, changing a system that incarcerates people with a punitive desire rather than like reducing those numbers? But do you have something that you've spoken to people or interviewed people about in terms of a transitional proposal, or one that would be politically effective?
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting because that was another thing in the documentary that was, you know, I didn't know what I was gonna hear in response to questions like that. And you know, the abolitionists that I interviewed were, you know, all like, this is a long-term project. You know, this is not something that can happen overnight. If the police were gone tomorrow, we'd have all other kinds of problems, because we don't know how to not call the cops, you know, if our neighbor's trash can is in the wrong place, you know. So the answer is, it's a multi-leveled solution, right? It's not just throw people in cages. It's resources, it's education, it's you know, reparations, it's you know, communities coming together, people learning how to talk and listen and communicate with one another, which was most of what I was doing with my consulting, you know, before the pandemic. It's like really teaching people how to connect and empathize with another person's lived experience. You know, it's like all of that stuff needs to happen. And then, yeah, if you have, you know, a violent offender or something, you know, like a crime, there would be systems in place with the communities to deal with that. That might mean removing somebody for a certain amount of time. I think, the DA, George Gascon, had mentioned that. He's like, you may need to remove somebody, you know, temporarily, but 95% of people who are, you know, going to jail get out, you know, so there has to be support. There has to be, I mean, it's a shift in how we view each other also.
I think what we have to, when we have these conversations, the premise is wrong, right? When people say, oh, you know, if we get rid of prisons, if we get rid of this criminal system that we have now, how are we going to address harm and address crime? And I think we have to acknowledge that we do not use that. That's not what our criminal system is here for now. That's not what we pretend that that's how we address crime or that's how we address harm, but it's not, right? We actually, the truth of it, and it's not hyperbolic language, the American criminal system, 2 million people incarcerated, 400,000 of those people have not had a trial, have not been convicted of anything. American prison system is a business, and it's a business that is very much so slavery. That's fact. That's why there's the carve out in the 13th Amendment. You're enslaving people and you're making billions of dollars, $11.6 billion to be, you know, more exact, off of those people. So it's not there. That criminal system is not there to address the harms and to prevent them. In fact, it's operating as, I just did an interview recently, and it was asked specifically because the politicians discussed it, like, how is it going to affect our business? These people losing their jobs, trying to decarcerate. They're very much so invested in churning people throughout the system. That's why it's the same communities, the same under-resourced communities, police like this, and they get these collateral consequences that'll never get them out of poverty. And so it continues, and that fuels this system. So I think the first thing we got to acknowledge is that we're not addressing it. That's not meant to address these issues. All of those issues, every social ill, everything that we, claim to condemn, that we slap the book at people about, is being reproduced by this system, and that is intentional. So that's the first thing. Is what we would need to do is, for the first time as a society, actually start to say, hey, how do we actually address these issues? How do we help people? How do we help solve these problems, rather than just, condemn it in rhetoric, but in actuality just produce more of the same violence and harms? And I think the second thing is, abolition is a vision of tomorrow. It's a vision of the future. No one is under the impression that they're going to close all the courts and all the prisons today. The whole idea is, all right, currently we have mass incarceration because we've invested billions and billions of dollars into addressing crime and harm this way. But if we actually began to divest from this system bit by bit, and this money that we keep putting into mass incarceration and policing, and we instead gave it to those under-resourced communities, we gave them the money for housing, for mental health, education, we would see that over time, this system, we would start to rely on it less in and of itself until we get to that place. So that's why, people will say things, well, oh, we need reform, not realizing that, the reform efforts that matter, those are the abolitionists pushing that, right? Like when I talk about bail reform a lot, it's because that's the steps. Those are the bricks that we begin to divest, right? As we get bail reform and we begin to decarcerate, and we begin to move like this, and where we don't have a criminal system, because it's a policy choice. It's a policy choice to use incarceration and prison to address these different things. And it's a policy choice America deliberately made. Always remember, like, we didn't always have mass incarceration. That was a deliberate explosion that happened when you got a president who made the choice, we are going to address it this way. So instead, it's all right, all these different reform efforts. It's not that there's a problem with reform. Reform is necessary. All these different reform efforts that actually divest from the system is necessary to get us to that abolitionist place. So that's what it's about. It's like, oh, if I actually give people what they need, you're going to see less of those harms. You're going to see less of this. You're going to see less people relying on the police. So.
On that point, what do you view, and this could be a question for either Matthew or both of you, what is the biggest barrier to any progress in this area? Is it lack of education? Is it big business? Is it capitalism? Is abolition possible under capitalism? Like these are, I think there's a lot of, barriers at play. What do you view as maybe the biggest one that needs to be, taken?
I think it's how we are indoctrinated. I think we're indoctrinated to believe in the system around us. And so even we're taught, right, that justice is synonymous with policing and prisons. We're literally taught that as little kids. It's like, oh, you need to know 911. Make sure you know that number. You play cops and robbers. Cops are the good guys. The bad guys are this. And we are fed that throughout society. So what happens is people develop this mentality that anybody in the criminal system or that has contacts with the criminal system, they are bad. They are deserving of that. They did something to be there. That ultimately the system is just. The system is about producing justice. And when you see these stories and these examples of it not doing that, rather than think of that as this is how the system is working, this is routine, this is what's happening all over the country every day, people think of it as a system that is otherwise just and meant to produce justice is making a mistake. You know what I mean? So any real serious change or any effort to really dismantle the system is met by people who their only information they really have of the system is that it's just. The first time they're really hearing, they're not getting this information because we have a society that's very invested from keeping people from knowing things, because when people know more, times change, right? That's what we've watched. We've seen in our lifetimes how much social consciousness has shifted because we're exposed to different things. And that's why you see now so much of a concerted effort on the part of politicians to keep certain information, ban the books, keep that out the schools, keep it all together, because they know if people learn more about it, they will oppose it. But what'll actually happen is if they don't learn the information about the system, if they don't know how the system works, because all they get is propaganda fed to them in the media, fed to them entertainment, fed to them and everything, what they'll hear is they'll see a George Floyd and it's like, oh, that's really sad that happened to him. But they don't oppose any of the fact that his community is so over-policed, why police were called in and why police brutalize in general. They don't oppose all of the different things that made it possible. So to me, the biggest barrier, the biggest issue is the way our society is just indoctrinated around propaganda. And I think our best push to that is education, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. There's the financial investment in locking people up and militarizing the police. And then that was one of the things also, the propaganda part, when I really started to look back at the show. I'm going to be 50 in March. So, I grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s with all the cop shows and Stallone. Like I was watching Cobra. It was on cable like a month ago, and it was like, holy crap, it's all propaganda. He's the guy we call when nothing else works. And, he kills this guy, and the reporter's like, who are you to be judge and jury? And so he grabs the reporter and he's like, tell that to his family, the guy that died, and it was like wall to wall, just like, we need the worst of the worst to protect us from the worst of the worst.
Yeah. And I think, what's funny and insidious about propaganda? People will think, it's that they're not showing you the brutality and the violence. No, it's worse than that. Cop shows and Law and Order and these things show you police that break the law nonstop, and they show you them being violent, but they justify it to you. Like, they needed to do that. Like, they treat constitutional requirements as though it's impeding the police's ability to be good. Like, how much propaganda is embedded in everything? That was actually the narrative that I just fed to you just there. You would think that came from something that wasn't Law and Order. That was the Chippendale Rescue Rangers new movie that just I swear to God, I was in this house like, I can't have nothing. And then in that moment, I was like, wait a second, were Chippendale the ops the whole time? I'm like,
they're the Rescue Rangers,
yes. And then you watch him watching Darkwing Duck. I'm like, oh my God, he's the ops. I'm like, the Powerpuff Girls. I'm like,
these are all my favorite shows.
The Powerpuff Girls are the main police brutality. Ooh, the Mojo Jojo.
Wait, Tailspin was smugglers, weren't they? Wasn't Tailspin smugglers? Like those, at least they were real ones, right?
Yeah,
I think we got one. Yeah.
We can keep Tailspin. But yes,
okay,
in everything. It's very much so in everything. And I think about that. Like, people think you're like, it is funny when you use like cartoons and those kind of examples, but it shows how deep it is. If you watch Powerpuff Girls and it becomes okay for the mayor to click the button the minute they see Mojo Jojo, all Mojo Jojo is doing is grocery shopping, but because they've decided Mojo Jojo is a criminal, Mojo Jojo gets his ass beat for white meat every time. Every time they see him, they just come in like, not so fast, Mojo Jojo. Like, and they just throw him in jail, no crime, no charges, grocery shop. He said, please, girls, and they beat him up. But I'm like, oh my God, that's how it comes to be. So yeah, I think to me, that's the greatest impediment is the propaganda.
Yeah, there was Dr. L. Jones mentioned the statistic that 30% of all content consumed is crime related, and 50% of fictional content is crime, police and crime related. So it's like we're just immersed in it. And then there's the way that news programs handle police issues and incarceration issues. And Alex Vitale says this in the documentary. The police are almost always given the benefit of the doubt and not really questioned and not really pushed.
They get the first statement out too, because like when you're a reporter and you're doing that 24-hour news cycle, it's the first thing you can print right away. The official police statement says this.
Their narrative is presented.
They teach that in school too. Like I went to school with with journalists, and they're taught to like take the police report as like gospel. Like that's what they like. It's in every level of education. This stuff, it's embedded.
And that's the issue, right? Is like, and we think that we live in this objective world because people, when you're educated like that, you think you're as someone who would be educated in journalism, they're telling you that you think that's the way. This is the objective. By the time you're getting criticized on Twitter, you're like, what do you mean? I'm following the professional. This is the official, because all they've ever taught is that police narrative is the fact. Police are this objective arbiter of justice rather than an interest group themselves or people whose word needs to be questioned. And that's what happens. I think of that even like with being a lawyer. Like there's certain things I'll realize now, like as a defense attorney, like, oh, I went to a prosecutor mill and I was being educated like someone who's going to a prosecutor mill, but it's being presented to you like, oh, this is objective. This is the way. And so you think, oh, I'm just being this way. And it's we and we're not taught, unfortunately, we're not taught to push back. We're taught, we're educated in a very consumer way. Our society wants us to be consumers. So they want us to just take everything at face value. I'm sure, I don't know if I'm the only one who's been kicked out of classes before for asking too many pushback, too many follow-up questions, but they don't want you to do that. That's not what they want. So I think that's the greatest. That's what we got to be doing as a society. And that's why this is really great, Matthew. This is an amazing contribution to this effort, this movement, this discourse. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, real quick, where can we find the documentary?
So the website is reimaginingsafetymovie.com, and that has all the information. We're having our West Coast premiere next Friday, February 3rd, at the San Pedro Film Festival, which is in the LA County area. And so, big festival. We're going to have a panel discussion afterwards, and then I'm having impact screenings, all over the country that we're setting up with different organizations and colleges. So, yeah, that Ole's
my work
with.
on it.
Thank you.
Nice.
So, if you go to the website and you can subscribe, and I'll send out information. And then on social media, Reimagining Safety Movie is my Instagram, and that's the best place to follow that also.
Thank
Great.
you
And
so much.
I'll link that
Matthew.
below the video as well, so it's easy to get to.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you so
thanks,
much for
y'all.
joining us.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah, I really
Bye.
appreciate that.